Welcome to another episode of Make Mental Health Matter. My name is Kelli Melissa Reinhart. I am your host for the show. If you've been watching that, you already knew that. But if you haven't been watching, thank you for joining in. And I am, as with, I think, every single time I have a guest on the show, I am very excited to have my guest today. But I think it's important that we just talk a little bit about our stories and how they really lead us into the work that we do, whether it is through coaching, which I've had a lot of coaches, or we find a path of healing through our own journey. Maybe we have a traumatic experience that we have gone through, and then we find this specific modality, or we find this therapy, or whatever it might be, that really helps us go through the journey, not just shove it down and not deal with it. We really have to move through whatever our experiences are. And if you've been watching for a while, you have noticed that most of my guests have a story of what they've been through. And then the coolest part about this is that most all of them that come on are either experts or professionals now in the space of whatever helped them through. I know I have talked about my journey with the loss of my sister. I've also shared that my son had seizures on the day of my sister's celebration of life. And the thing that helped me get through was I found neuro-linguistic programming, which is a different type of modality. It's a coaching and a therapy based modality. And that's the one that had been helpful for me. And that's why it really guided me into what I do today. As far as my nonprofit, I educate people to be able to help others in need, whether they're experiencing a mental health, substance abuse, or suicidal ideation, one of those challenges. And then really led me into this place of being able to coach and help and assist others wherever I possibly could. And that is just like all or most of my guests that I have on and my guest today. So without going on and on and on, let me tell you a little bit more about my guest today. So Michelle founded Light of Love Coaching in February 2020 and is a trauma sensitive certified holistic life coach. She empowers mission driven leaders and teams to overcome the culture of overgiving and self sacrifice so they don't lose themselves in their mission. Michelle guides leaders and teams to overcome compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. Through holistic coaching, trauma sensitive yoga, and breath work, clients connect more deeply to themselves, their mission, and their community, which creates long lasting, sustainable impact. When she's not coaching, speaking, or facilitating workshops, you can find Michelle dancing in her kitchen, biking to Pilates, and getting lost in the woods, or running with the sunrise. So without further ado, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kelli.
Of course. And I am excited. I know that you and I have talked many a times in the past, but having you on the show and knowing all the things that you do, can you tell the audience? I know I briefly introed you, but can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your journey?
Yeah, and I guess one of the parts that wasn't shared and part like a really the catalyst for me becoming a coach was after the death of my son and trying to find myself again. And I didn't like instantly say I want to be a coach, but it was in finding myself. And like you said, finding different modalities that really help me and continue to help me. And I really wanted to continue to help other people. And so that's really where my story started. And I was at this like moment of I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I know I want to do something. And I had a friend say to me, you should really be a coach. And so I dove into health coaching initially, and then I found this holistic life coaching certification. And during that certification, I realized I should be helping women who had lost children. And I did that for several years. And then as I started working with more organizations that were also helping bereaved parents, grieving moms, I realized a lot of the people running those organizations were overwhelmed, exhausted, and not giving enough to themselves. And that's when I made the shift to really focus on helping leaders of mission driven and nonprofit organizations so they could continue to like make the big impact that they wanted to make. I didn't want them to stop what they were doing, because a lot of them, I was going to their conferences and retreats and all of the different events that they were having, and they were so beneficial for me. But then when I was talking to them in the background and hearing how much they were struggling, I didn't want them to stop what they were doing. And so that's when I really started making this shift into helping more leaders and teams of these organizations, because I want them to be able to continue with their mission.
Yeah, which I think is amazing. And I do have questions around that, but I'm curious if you would be willing to share just a little bit more about the loss of your son.
Yes. And even just watching your intro, it really made me go back to this place of before my son died. I always have been a positive person. I did the Clifton Strengths Finders, and my number one strength is positivity. And so I always thought when people talked about like depression and anxiety and anything like that, I was always just like, they just need, a positive attitude. Like I just like didn't understand why people couldn't just shake themselves out of it, essentially. And after my son died, and then we decided not to have any more kids, we have a living daughter who is older than our son. That was also a part of my depression. I really went into depression, and I had anxiety and PTSD before that too, before like making that decision of not continuing to grow our family. But it was that like loss of identity of, I didn't know who I was. I didn't think I would be a parent of an only child, or what looks like an only child. And I really had to come to find myself again. And so I just found myself in this major depression. And then also, the PTSD and anxiety that came with just like his death as well. And I realized that there wasn't anything that could motivate me out of it. And I actually did this. I was writing a monthly newsletter at the time. And as I was writing, I was just like, I can't get the words out on paper. So I just flipped open my camera and started talking into my camera to send it as a video, as opposed to typing out this newsletter. And I just talked about how like being motivated is overrated, and that motivation only gets you so far. And motivation is kind of short-lived, and you really need a deep burning driving desire why to change or to grow or whatever you're wanting to do. And that's what really helped me in making the shifts that I needed to make, was like finding my why and not being so reliant on just like positive vibes and, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And how did your son pass again?
He died in his sleep. So it was SIDS. And so it was definitely like called an ambulance, did CPR, all of that kind of stuff. So like, and we live in a small town. And at the time, my daughter, two of her classmates their dad was the police officer that came to our house. And so I would see him at, class events and, those kinds of things. And anytime I would see him, I just like, that was like some of those like triggers of PTSD. Anytime I would hear an ambulance, which we hear them all the time because we live near a hospital. And just, so all of those things really triggered me into like, just like this major like anxiety from his death.
And then you really you found the more trauma-based healing modalities. And was that really like where you were able to shift into what you do now?
I found more of the trauma-based modalities more recently, over the last couple years, actually. So there were other things that were helping me that weren't specific to trauma. That's more of like the holistic life coaching stuff and some of that work, which is based on psychotherapy, but it's a coaching model as opposed to having like a therapy license. Big things that helped me were movement. And that's where like some of the trauma sensitive yoga has come in, even though trauma sensitive yoga isn't the focus isn't the movement piece, but it is part of it. And so when I started, it wasn't anything in specific that was like geared towards that, but it was like all of a sudden I was like, okay, I need to do this like physically for myself. We got 2 therapists, one for our family, one for myself, like, and then I dove into this coaching program. I just like dove into all these different things to really help me to feel like myself again.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the grief and loss journey is one that is hard but easy, I guess, to explain to people that have experienced it. But I know that we all experience it very differently. And I'm much like you. I just keep going. Like that's my coping mechanism is the just keep going, just keep going. And I know I ended up hitting like what I call the virtual wall the year after my sister passed. And I was like, oh, wow, I got to take care of myself. And I know like when you and I had connected the very, very first time and you were talking about the program that you were doing and really identifying how to help leaders in that space take care of themselves, because it's those of us that are in this space that help others that we forget to take care of ourselves. So I think it's just really important, the work that you're doing. And I'm curious, with you being able to help others, do you notice that it also parts of you start healing along with helping others?
Definitely. And I also find now it's a little bit different because I'm talking to so many different people, but initially those people that I was talking about where I was going to their conferences and their retreats, they were people like you, Kelli, where it's like you had your own experience and you wanted someone else's experience to be different. And so that's where like some of that like trauma stuff started coming in, was not only looking at our own trauma, but then like when you're experiencing other people's trauma alongside of them, I think is just so important to recognize. And yeah, so I don't even remember what you asked me, but but just like that experience of like, okay, something happened to me and I want it to be different for other people. And I think it's so important to continue to take care of yourself and not forget about that even though you may be like further along on your healing journey, so to speak, than the people that you're helping, that it's still like it doesn't really end, or you need to like make sure you're still doing something for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's what so I was doing a support group, like a grief and loss support group for a little while. And I found that although I felt it was really good, and this may sound really bad, but I thought it was really great research for me to understand like what others were experiencing and then also how I could potentially help them outside of coaching or therapy or any of those other modalities, right? But I found myself not wanting to get on the calls because it almost took me back to like that place where I was grieving, like whole heart, like, the full and grieving, because that's where people are that would come into my support groups. And we didn't have enough consistency that I could like help people get to that next place, although some of them did. But what I found in helping others is that it helped heal me, but it also helped me acknowledge that I'm not there anymore. And I also need that consistency of being able to help others so that I can move them into that position, besides the like cycle of like, oh, I'm sad. Oh, I'm sad. Oh, I'm sad. Right. It's hard, or it can be potentially hard for those of us that want to help others, but yet having that like cycle that doesn't really ever get anywhere, I guess.
Yeah.
So I am, well, first we're going to go to our quick first sponsored break, but when we come back, then we can chat a little bit more about your story and then how you help people specifically. So we'll be right back after this quick sponsored break. I lost my middle sister, Kelli, to a completed suicide on February 20th, 2017.
My story, all of it isn't unique. I am a domestic violence survivor and a recovering addict. For 14 years, I was in active addiction. And because of Kelli and the work that she does and the opportunity to have my voice heard, I was able to stay clean and sober and have hit a year. I'm still here. And if it wasn't for Kelli answering my call the day that I thought I was going to take my life.
Curious, and I know that I've heard a lot in the BIPOC community, it is very hush hush. It's like one of those things that you don't talk about. Like, you literally feel like it's not a conversation you can have. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
First, shout out to Kelli, because I'm glad that she asked the question. I researched you before I went on your show, and I saw how real and authentic you were. And I just appreciate the question, because it is different and we have to have tough, courageous conversations. So yes, I always say I'm a triple diversity threat. I'm a Black woman with multiple disabilities. Now, I'm not really a threat, but to other people, I may be, because people fear the unknown and what they're uncomfortable with.
Kelli's passionate commitment to mental health awareness is a beautiful thing. It's clear in her social media posts, it's clear in the resources that she puts together, in the activities that she provides, her collaboration with organizations, and the consistent way that she continues to deliver a message, encouraging people to understand that they can share openly and to break the stigma around mental health. Kelli's topics cover children and adults, talk about things that we can do as a community, things that we can do individually, and her website is packed with information and resources and all kinds of contacts that you can use to reach out, whether you're dealing with something yourself or you're looking to help somebody else who is struggling. I encourage you to check it out.
And like that, we're back. If you happen to be just joining us, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you go back and watch the beginning of this. There's lots of goodness that we talked about. So Michelle, when we were chatting earlier, the thought that came up, especially as you were talking about going into these organizations, and you really found that the founders or the leaders were getting really burnt out and just feeling like, not taking care of themselves, right?
Yeah.
And I know I have been there before, especially with my nonprofit. And it was really only, I was just talking to somebody about this the other day, but it was really only about a year and a half-ish ago for me. And we are now 6 years into the nonprofit. But you get to these points that you're like, what the heck am I doing? And then there's these moments of like, well, if we don't make this happen or this happen or this happen, like we're not going to be able to go on. And I know for me, I have some, what I call my nonprofit support people, right? I was like, I need to create a group that's like just supporting nonprofits, leaders and CEOs and founders, because we don't really know what we're doing half the time, but also as we're helping others, we don't know how to take care of ourselves. So I'm just, I guess the question or the thought process that I'm going with is like, I'm sure that's something that you hear pretty often.
Yeah. And I think something that is important to note or notice is that everyone knows that we need to take care of ourselves, right? And I mean, self-care is like something that's been talked about forever. And it's almost like going another level deep with self-care. And it's not just about knowing that you need to do it, but it's about actually doing it and embodying that as like of who you are. So when I talked a little bit earlier about like identity of who you are and how a lot of times it's easy for leaders to get lost in their mission, especially if you are the founder and you have a real deep connection with that mission. It's easy to get lost in that and that being your only identity, but you also have an identity outside of that. And And how you find that or like reclaim that is by knowing who you are outside of that. And you can do that by taking time for yourself. And self-care isn't just about, the big things. It's not about like massages and manicures and pedicures, even though like I'm a big fan of massage and body work, and I get a massage regularly. I go to the chiropractor regularly. Like I do all of these things. But it's also like the daily little things that you're doing. And not everything needs to be something that takes 30 minutes to an hour. It can be 5 minutes that you're taking throughout the day. You're taking this 5-minute time to be mindful of your body. Are you telling yourself, are you saying like, oh, I don't need to go to the bathroom, I can wait, or I'm not hungry, I can wait? And when you keep doing that over and over again, you're telling your body and yourself that like, oh, like my needs don't matter. And yes, sometimes we're going to not be able to go to the bathroom right away and we can't eat exactly when we want to. But when you're doing that over and over again and you're waiting longer and longer to take care of yourself, that's when some of that burnout really comes in, because you're getting so used to saying no to yourself and saying yes to everyone else. And it's that reminder of, okay, I need to say yes to myself too. And when I'm saying yes to myself, I'm not saying no to everyone else. It's just, I need to also say yes to myself. And so it's that embodied practice of saying yes to yourself and not feeling guilty about it.
Yeah, I'm like preaching to the choir, right? Like that's how I feel. But I feel like even so like last year I felt very much in burnt out. I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this, right? But I was very much also in this place of good things were starting to come. And I was constructing actually my TEDx talk at that time, which was all about nonprofits being burnt out and then using like AI tools or technology to help a little bit more. So I was like literally living and breathing my TEDx talk. And then once I got on the stage, I thought it was going to be like this great release, right? Of like energy, which I think in a way it was. But I also acknowledged even at that point was like, oh, wow, like this is me. Like this is me right now. Like I wholeheartedly at that point really understood like what that burnt out looked like and why it is so important. And I mean, even fast forward like this year, for whatever reason, I mean, a good reason, but the floodgates of abundance opened this year, which was really, really amazing. But it made us really busy this year. And so now I'm reflecting again at this point as we come, I mean, really, as we ended September for National Suicide Awareness Month, which happened to be our busiest month, I have to reflect back and just say, hey, like, I've got to now shift back into that self-care piece of taking care of myself, allowing myself to say yes to myself, right? And really those boundaries that I created back in the day, like I have to be able to honor those for myself and for my family. So, yeah, I think it's just so important. And I wanted to say thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story with the audience. I know sometimes it's hard to, bring up things, but I do know that's what you do now. So,
Yeah. And I think you bring up something so valuable for people to understand. Like there's always going to be times that are busier and times that aren't as busy. And so when you can start implementing things on a regular basis, implementing practices on a regular basis, that maybe you might not be able to do them as often when you're in your busy season, but that you don't completely let them go, that you're still saying like, okay, and that's where it's like when you can practice them when you're not quite as busy. I mean, you're always going to be busy, right? But there's those times, like you said, like usually like right before a fundraising event, or for you, Suicide Awareness Month, that's when it's like intensely busy or like acutely busy. And so making sure that that's where like that embodiment of knowing yourself and making sure that you're taking care of yourself and implementing that in the less busy times can help you to implement it while you're busy. And then recognizing, okay, we're coming to the end of this. Like it's time for me to make sure I'm getting back into that flow of a little bit more care for myself, so that the next time the busy season comes around, I'm prepared and I'm not burning out in that in that season of extra busyness.
Yeah, I think it's also there becomes this fine balance that I know I've learned from mentors in the past of sometimes when you work less, you actually get more, which is such an interesting concept to like wrap your head around because you're like, wait, I can work less and get more? Like I'm so confused, but I think there is some truth behind that because you're probably getting more in other places when you're not just hyper focusing on the work, which can be challenging, especially in the nonprofit space.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
And I know you also mentioned really earlier, like, when we have traumas that come up, you also have found more recently the trauma-based type modalities. I'm curious because I've had this conversation, but it's been a while since we've talked about it. But can you just share, like, what does that mean? Like, what does trauma-based practices really mean?
For me, it really means having this lens of allowing people to be themselves and allowing for that space for people to not feel safe right away. I think that's one of those things is like oftentimes we try and say like, oh, this is a safe space. And yes, there's that intention, but I can't say if a space is safe for someone. Only they can decide that. And offering those opportunities for people to, if it doesn't feel safe for them, that they don't have to be there, or that they like there can be modifications made for them. So and that it doesn't feel like it's just them. Like that's available for everyone as well. Because oftentimes with trauma too, it's like you feel like, you know, you might feel like you're the only one. And so it can feel like I can't do this because then I'm making a big deal out of something that shouldn't be a big deal. And it's like, well, if you can create this culture of it's not a big deal to take care of yourself. And if something comes up that no one else recognizes, that it's okay for you to take care of yourself in whatever way that looks like. Maybe you need to step out of a meeting for 5 minutes, and who's ever leading that meeting isn't going to make a big deal out of it. Like, oh, where did this person go? Why is your camera off? Or whatever that is. It's just like having that recognition that sometimes people need to care for themselves. And so, and this goes back to, I have been asked in the past, like, oh, what's the difference between trauma informed and trauma sensitive? Mm-hmm. And I asked my mentor this when I was going through my trauma sensitive yoga certification. And what they said was really a lot of times trauma informed tends to be this like checkbox that people have, is especially with larger organizations. Like, we want to be a trauma informed organization. So we bring in someone to do a trauma informed workshop, and now we're trauma informed, boxes checked, as opposed to being trauma sensitive is really embodying those practices and what are you actually implementing to make sure that people feel, whether it's staff, employees, volunteers, or people that you're working with, are actually feeling like that they are being seen and heard, and that they're not feeling that if they are feeling unsafe, that it's okay for them to take care of themselves, and they're not being called out for not taking care, or for them for taking care of themselves.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good way to put it too. Is like, I mean, trauma informed versus trauma sensitive, and really the practice of what you're doing or implementing versus just checking the box. Because that is, I mean, when I think about trauma informed, right? Like, it sounds to me like it's just kind of like our a lot of people say like mental health matters. Yes, it matters, but what are we actually doing about it? And that's why my nonprofit is Make Mental Health Matter, and the show, right? Because we're making it matter. We're not just saying that it matters. So it's kind of, yeah, that difference. And that is such a good way to put it, is like trauma informed versus trauma sensitive. And I think that's a huge part of the conversation too, especially me being from like a corporate world originally, that we had guest speakers come in and share how great it is about self-care and all these things. But then the next breath was, why aren't you at your desk? Where are you going? We told you to take walks, but we don't really want you to take walks, right? So yeah, it's like the checkbox versus the actual doing. So that's a wonderful way to put it.
Yeah. And a lot of times, like, that falls on leadership. And that's where, like, when I started making this shift, into working with organizations, that's why I really realized like I need to work with leaders, because you can have your team go do these things, but if the leader isn't on the same page, then there's really no point, because they're not implementing the things that were talked about in workshops and whatever else you're doing to try and keep employees feeling well and keep people feeling well on the team.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. We're gonna go to our quick last sponsored break, but once we get back, we'll talk a little bit more and then share where people can actually reach out and find you too. So we'll be right back after this quick sponsor break.
Host of the Health Revolution TV show. Join us Tuesdays and Thursdays live 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where our mission is simple: engaging conversations, elevating health and wellness, empowering transformation. Right here on the Achieve TV channel on E360 TV.
Hi, Laura Cross, your host for Mindful Mondays, every Monday at 1 p.m. Central Time, where you can embark on a transformative journey of self-care and ultimate happiness. Tune in to the Voyage to Vitality channel on the Achieve TV network. Mindful Mondays with Laura Cross. Be there, be mindful, and join us on E360 TV.
And we're back again. Well, Michelle, I think that, I mean, just this conversation about self-care, being able to help organizations, also sharing your story through the loss of your son. And I know that there has been times that you also have really led into what you do now, right? Finding the yoga and finding or being really a life coach starting out, and then moving more into like the trauma-based or trauma sensitive yoga, and then really being able to help leaders in this space that if we can, and I feel like it's like we can tell our agents what to do, but yet we don't do it ourselves. And or it goes both ways, I think, right? Like, so maybe the upper leadership is doing it, but the lower isn't. So I think there is this fine balance that we really need to start incorporating in, whether it's corporate, whether it's in organizations, or it's in communities. I think that it's just a really important conversation, and self-care is not selfish. It's actually very much needed.
Yes, definitely.
So I wanted to just kind of circle back a little bit, because I know that we've talked a lot about like what you do specifically, and then also a little bit about your story. But is there anything that maybe we didn't talk about that would be helpful, you think, in this space for those that are either listening or watching?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in talking about like being trauma sensitive and embodying these practices, especially in regards to organizations, whether for-profit or nonprofit, is when you can embody this and help people to feel like they are safe at work, and they're safe to go to HR and share that something happened, or safe to go to their supervisor. When you can create those spaces, that's when people feel safer, and they don't feel alone. Because when we're talking even about like suicide, it's like oftentimes people feel like they don't have any choice, like that there's no other option. And being trauma sensitive is the opposite of that, is that you're offering people choices, or that they feel like they actually have a choice. Because so often people feel like they don't have choices. And when you don't feel like you have a choice, that's when you do things that are detrimental to your own health or to other people, whatever that might look like, and potentially even suicide, unfortunately. And so we want people to feel like they have choices, and that it's okay for them to express themselves and that they're not going to like quote unquote get in trouble for that. I even think about our living daughter. So often she's like, "Oh, I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble." I'm like, "You're not going to get in trouble," and letting her know that. And so that's where it's like all of this stuff, it trickles down from like where you're working, what you're doing, into your family, into relationships. And that's where I feel like you said, even like with making mental health matter, these things matter so much, one person at a time, because that's how we really create this shift and this change within organizational cultures, within family dynamics, and then within society as well.
Yeah, and that was the other thing that had popped into my head too, is like the understanding that not all spaces are safe for everybody. I hadn't ever, I mean, I always, especially when I train, I try to let people know this is a safe space. There's no judgment. I mean, but you also have to consider, right? Like maybe they don't feel safe at first, but then as we go along, by the time we get like an hour or 2 hours in, right? They're like, oh, okay, I can be safe. And I try to open up the conversations with my story just to like let them know, like, I'm here. This is why I do what I do. And I feel safe enough to give you that information. And if you feel like you want to open up to me, amazing. If you don't, that's okay, right? I do, for whatever reason, whenever people come and talk to me, they just like, bleh, like their whole story comes out. So I hope that that's a good reflection on me, that I am good at creating safe space for people.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's really, even going back to what you were saying when you were in corporate too, it's less about what you say and it's more about your actions behind what you say. Because if you say this thing like, hey, let's go for walks on a regular basis, but then when push comes to shove, you're like, hey, you need to do this instead of taking care of yourself. Well, then you're telling people, okay, what you say isn't really what you mean. And that's how when you're trying to create a safe space, isn't actually a safe space happens. And so it's in the doing and the embodying of that is how the safe spaces actually are created for the individuals there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, I mean, I think it's definitely a skill that you have to learn.
Yeah,
It's
it
not
is.
something it's not always innate in people, right? But yeah, it's definitely something that you can learn to be able to do. And I think that's probably the best part of it.
Yeah. And it's, you're right. It's a skill and it's learnable. You have to be willing to put in the effort to want to learn that skill if you truly want to create safer spaces for people, is that you're willing to do the work and practice and try, and also give yourself grace for, and especially if you're talking to someone or something happens, that you say, hey, I'm really sorry, I'm working on this and I'm going to try and do this next time. That again is like allowing other people to then be able to say the same thing when something happens with them, that they're not doing it in the way that they hoped that they were going to do it, and offering that space for yourself to say, I'm willing to work on this, knowing that it is a new skill that you're learning. And when you're learning a new skill, it takes practice, and you're not going to do it quote unquote right or perfectly the first time that you're trying it. And it's going to take time and persistence over time.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, I'm like, I like to be perfectly imperfect, because I don't ever think that I do things perfectly, but I always learn, right? Like, what's the way that I can shift it, or how can I do that better next time? And I try to own that. I also call it kind of giving and receiving, because sometimes I am challenged with receiving, but I oftentimes like give, but then there's nothing left for me. So I have to practice receiving from others and not taking, like, if it's feedback or something like that, right? Like, not taking it personal, just making sure that I learn from whatever is being said so that I can change it and shift it the next time, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to just share, or ask you, just share, you will share. So if somebody was to come and they were wanting to work with you, what would that look like?
So I work with people one-on-one, in groups, or with teams. And sometimes it's usually a combination of some of the holistic life coaching practices and then also the trauma sensitive yoga practices as well. I like to work with people over a period of time because, like we just talked about, everything is a practice. And so the learning that goes along with it is so important. But there are opportunities for workshops, for speaking engagements, different things like that too, whatever kind of fits the organization or the individual's needs that they're looking for. But everything that I offer also includes some component of me, and not just like a course or something to do on your own. There's always like some sort of live interaction with me as well.
Nice. That's awesome. I mean, I know how important it is just like being the founder of an organization to be able to have somebody. And I know that in the past, we have bounced ideas back and forth, which I think is so helpful too, of being able to just know, like, is this something that people would be interested in or not? And then having that lived experience, right? Like I feel like when we're embodying whatever it is that we're doing, we really have to like take ourselves out of it and be willing to learn what other people's experiences are. And that's what I have always noticed about you, is that that's what you really want to do, is like, hey, I have an idea, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be effective for others. This is what I'm thinking, and do you think that would be helpful? So I think that's just helpful across the board. I mean, especially for organizations and leaders that may be feeling burnt out or overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely.
So if somebody wanted to work with you, or follow your journey, really, where is the best place for them to do that?
I would say number one, Instagram. I feel like I am able to share the most there, and as Michelle Vande Hey, so just like one word. Otherwise, I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. Just look up Michelle Vande Hey. I don't think there's very many of them out there. Otherwise, my website or email, if people prefer email, Michelle@lightoflovecoaching.com, or lightoflovecoaching.com. That is my business name. So yeah, you can reach out to me there as well.
Amazing. And for those of you that are listening, it's lightoflovecoaching.com that you can find her, or any of the social channels. Michelle with 2 L's, Vande, VandeHey. So this is such a amazing conversation. I appreciate you being a guest, and again, being vulnerable, sharing your experience. I know that it is not an easy journey by any means, especially through the loss of a child, and then really shifting into this place that you are actually helping people, which ultimately is helping in your healing journey. But I think it's amazing that you're able to just share that and be honest, transparent, and then really shift and change as people are needing help too.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kelly. I so appreciate the time and what you're doing as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. All right, y'all. That was another amazing episode of Make Mental Health Matter show. I mean, these conversations, right? Like, they can be hard. It can be hard sharing our experiences and whatever we've been through. But I think it's important because I want you, as the audience, whether you are listening or watching, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are also lots of different options, modalities, places that you can be safe. And there are people out there that really, truly want to help. So if you are somebody that is struggling, or you maybe resonate with what Michelle talked about, and you're like, hey, I just want to have a conversation and see what that looked like. Again, there's so many different modalities and ways that she really helps. And you don't have to necessarily be part of an organization, although she is very helpful with leaders. So again, I'm going to pop up her website here one more time. I got to find it wherever I put it. Oh, there we go. lightoflovecoaching.com. And if you are in need of other resources, you can always go to the makementalhealthmatter.org. and click on resources. We have our trusted resource hub there that have lots of people. We're actively building it. So just be aware that there are a lot more coming. But if you don't find something there, and maybe you've found somebody on the show like Michelle that you want to get connected, just reach out to us, because we are more than happy to navigate you through getting resources. It can be challenging, especially when you might be struggling or having or had a traumatic experience. So again, it's makementalhealthmatter.org and click on resources and the trusted resource hub. Or if you're watching, it's scrolling down the bottom here. All right. No matter what you do, make sure you come back next week, because I have more incredible guests lining up that really truly are in this helping space and want to showcase what they do now and or their journey. And that's really the whole point of the show. So I will catch you next week, whether you're watching on E360 TV at 5 p.m. or you're listening on Dream Vision 7 Radio at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. I'll see you next week. Thank you.